Doug, I might just start with a bit of society stuff and then introduce Ray. First of all, thanks for all being here. And I do want to acknowledge, obviously, we're in the mourning period for Her Majesty having passed away last week, or earlier this week. We did consider postponing, sort of following the tradition, but then we thought that the Australian government had enough difficulty organising the public holiday, so we decided to press ahead. I'd like to welcome Ray. You've probably read his biography in on the invitation, but Ray's had a long 30-year career as a naval engineer, both at sea and ashore. Certainly challenging jobs, particularly the ones where you're supporting big ships from ashore and involved in configuration changes and major refits and maintenance. So I think he's got more than enough skills and experience to be managing the maintenance of Sydney Heritage Fleet boats. So Ray, I think, we're looking forward to hearing about it. And obviously the little Navy workboats that you've got in the collection hopefully aren't too difficult. But thanks for joining us, and over to you.
All right, thanks very much, David. I'll move on to the share screen. The PowerPoint presentation that I'm about to talk to and give has a few sound bites in it, so don't let anyone be shocked by it. Now, I call this the harbour's best kept secret because we really struggle to get our name out there, and not too many. A lot of people see our vessels around the harbour, but a lot of them don't know who we are. And I address a number of Probus clubs, and I quite often, I ask the question, and we're really struggling to be known, but we're fairly sizable. So what's now known as the Heritage Fleet was founded in December 1965 as the Lady Hopetoun and Port Jackson Marine Steam Museum Limited. So there's two founding members, Warwick Turner and Mike Richards. They purchased the steam-powered launch Lady Hopetoun from the New South Wales government when the government had no further use for it. Now, Lady Hopetoun's a 1902 VIP and Vice Regal steam launch, named after the Governor-General at the time, his wife, the then Lady Hopetoun. Now, she was, as in the boat, not Lady Hopetoun herself. She was designed by Walter Reeks. Now, Walter Reeks, you'll hear his name come up a number of times during this presentation, because he was a very well-known and obviously quite busy naval architect in Sydney. So Lady Hopetoun was built in Berrima Bay. So back over the years, there's been lots of shipbuilding and boat building around Sydney Harbour everywhere, and boat repair. And it's probably good that a lot of it's gone now because the harbour's been reclaimed and is cleaned up. But a lot of it was happening back then. So she was built in Berrima Bay in North Sydney for the princely sum of £4,500. Now, imagine what such a vessel would cost these days. But anyway, so she was constructed of New Zealand kauri planks, American elm frames, so some beautiful timbers. Her deck house is teak. Now, teak, obviously, and you'll hear a bit more about the use of teak in boat building, but it obviously was a reasonable price back in the day. She still retains her original triple expansion steam engine, but her original coal-fired boiler was replaced in the 1920s. Now, I'm assuming that her boiler has been replaced a number of times because we're in the process of replacing it now. And I think they've dropped the boiler back into the hull, and I think she should be operational again within some weeks. So she was, boilers only last usually about 20 years or so, if you're lucky, depending on the use of the vessel and how well they're maintained. So she's probably had about 4 or 5 boilers, I would imagine, in this time. She's probably carried more famous people on her decks than just about any other vessel in Australia. Among them, King George VI as the Duke of York, the Duke of Windsor, Duke of Gloucester, King and Queen of Thailand, Governors General of Australia, Governors and Premiers of New South Wales. and many other world figures. But for all of her fame and carting, moving people like that around, she hasn't always been full of glamour, and in her early days, she was used as a relief payboat. She did small towing jobs and took the children who lived on Fort Denison to school every day. So she's pretty busy and as I say, a fairly regular sight on Sydney Harbour. So that was the genesis of how we started all those years ago. So what do? We like to think that we're a living museum that conserves and restores old vessel, and the emphasis is on restoration, maintenance, and the key to it is operation. We try and get as many of our vessels running as we possibly can, and we use them. We go out, take them out and play with them. So the main focus is on Sydney Harbour, and with a lot of our unique vessels around, but some of it is branched out into other areas. And we preserve and we build a skills base. So we use a lot of the skills and teach a lot of the skills that are rapidly disappearing. And they're the skills that you need to maintain old vessels. So in some respects, we sort of see ourselves as a bit of a men's shed or a women's shed for ship tragics. We try and build social capital and get people out and get people involved and interested. Here's just a typical example. We've got a workshop round at Rozelle where most of the restoration takes place. And here's a couple of guys using a reamer to ream out a hole before they hot rivet it. So we do obviously hot riveting and as our restoration work. And you can see this pneumatic thing, three old guys holding it. Normally you'd only need two, but when this thing bites, it can toss you around and really do some damage. So all good fun for us oldies. We also do research, a bit like the Historical Society. So we've got collections of ships' plans, drawings, books, and we've got models and artifacts and paintings and all sorts of things. So down in Wharf 7, if you ever get involved, you can go and play with things like that. Let's get back to the vessels. So the next vessel to talk about is the steam tug Waratah. Now, I'm sure that Sydney-siders would have seen Waratah around the harbour quite frequently. So she was built, or she was acquired by the fleet in 1968, but she was built at Cockatoo Island. So she was launched on the 21st of May in 1902. And she was originally named the Barunda. I'm not sure how she got a name change to Waratah, but her primary role was to tow dredges and barges between the various ports along the New South Wales coast. So she wasn't a harbour tug. She worked primarily up and down the coast. Now she's the oldest tug in working order in Australia, and you can see how things change, and we all know how ship's crewing changes over the years. But she carried a crew of 14, including 6 officers, although I suppose being at sea going up and down the coast, they had to have watchkeepers, so she wasn't just a day boat. So she carried 6 officers who were accommodated in separate cabins down aft. And today, sailing around Sydney Harbour, believe it or not, she still requires a crew of 14 people down the stokehold, feeding coal into the boiler. But with the raked funnel, the classic lines of the day, the raked funnel and the counter stern, Waratah has the graceful proportions of vessels of that era. So in 1968, it was announced that she was beyond economical repair and she was going to be disposed of for scrap. Luckily, the Heritage Fleet realised her historical importance, acted to save her, and purchased her from the Department of Public Works. So it took 5 years to restore her. 5 years, and now she's up and running, fully operational, and regularly takes passengers on trips around Sydney Harbour. And occasionally with docking, she still needs plates replaced, just like any old ship. But she's a beautiful old tug. And she's also gained worldwide recognition for preservations of old ships. Now we'll branch off to, well, this vessel that I'm about to talk about started off as a steamship that was converted to diesel, and that's the Sydney Ferry Kanangra, built in 1912, and she was donated to the Heritage Fleet in 1987. So this photo shows the original configuration. Again, the high funnel to draw the funnel gases out, and typical black smoke. She would have been she would have been burning coal, I would imagine, back in those days. Eventually converted to oil burning. However, this is a picture of her latest, her later. She was built at Mort Stock. So Mort Stock in Sydney had a facility in Balmain, and they also had an area up on the mouth of the Lanco River, where they built and repaired vessels. So she was launched on the 14th of August 1912, originally coal-fired, converted to diesel in 1959, and acquired by the Heritage Fleet in operational condition back in 1987. So she was a K-class boat, and a sister ship to the Cuttable. We all know Cuttable and her sad story, but slightly smaller, I think, not quite the same size as Cuttable. But she was ferrying passengers around Sydney Harbour before the start of World War I. And she's the last of this type of ferry still afloat. Well, she's not afloat anymore. We've pulled her out of the water recently, and we'll look at a few pictures of that shortly. But she was moving people around Sydney Harbour for over 70 years. And she carried workers to and from Cockatoo Island, as well as taking thousands of trips with office workers and others into the CBD, school children, and so on. She will eventually be going again, believe it or not. You will see photographs of her. You'll wonder. And luckily, she was saved. Unlike Barragoola, for Sydney siders, you'd be aware of Barragoola, who was alongside at the coal loader at Waverton, who sunk on New Year's Day this year for the people in elsewhere in the country. Another old ferry that they wanted to restore her, but she sunk alongside, and it cost the New South Wales government about $4.5 million to then cut her up and dispose of her. Here's a picture of Kanangra out of the water. A lot of concrete in her hull. There was concrete and foam and all sorts of things put in her to keep her afloat. Interestingly, when they pulled her out of the water, they realised that at least the outside of the hull, I'm not quite sure of the inside, but the outside of the hull's still in reasonable shape. And there has been restoration ongoing in Kanangra through all these years while she's been floating around at Rozelle. So she's not totally derelict. But the intention is to eventually get her going again. And we move from steam to, what was sail. And this is the Boomerang. Now, Boomerang was originally named Bona, and she was donated by the Albert family. And Robert Albert has been one of our great supporters over the years. Now, she was built in 1903 in Lavender Bay in Sydney, and she was, again, we go back to Walter Reeks. She was designed by Walter Reeks, and he also designed ferries for the Balmain Ferry Company. So in 1929, Frank Albert of the famous music family around in Sydney acquired her, and she stayed with the Albert family until they gave her to us in 1987. She's built of hardwood frames, cowrie decks and deck beams. She's copper fastened throughout, beautiful old boat building techniques. And in 1927, she was described as Australia's largest yacht. But she hasn't carried sail since the early 1930s and is now driven by engine only. And unfortunately, she's not in great shape at the moment. And it's going to cost a hell of a lot of money to restore her. We're looking at where we can put her to pull her out of the water to restore her, or to start restoring her when we've got the money. Money, as you can well imagine, is always tight. So she's got beautiful accommodation, saloon, and the owner's cabin being particularly attractive. And again, she's been a regular sight, not with sail up, but a regular sight around Sydney Harbour for over 100 years now. And she's used for public events on Sydney Harbour, and there's always a popular vessel. So beautiful thing, and I hope she doesn't. We don't lose her. It's a very difficult thing to keep going. Right, now we go to the first of the ex-Navy vessels, and Harmon. And I'm sure that some of the people in the audience today would have travelled on Harmon at some stage. She was built in 1947, and she was in regular use around Sydney Harbour. But she's a relative spring chicken compared to the older vessels in our fleet. So she was built in the 1940s by the firm Story and Kears. And I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with the old Story and Kears workshop on the shores of Balmain, which is now, the old buildings there have got a markedly different usage, but she was an unobtrusive workhorse representative of many of the working craft around Sydney Harbour, and she's never worked anywhere else apart from the harbour, and she's used by the Heritage Fleet to run tours to different places now. Also, we got the Berrima. Now, Berrima was a 1954 Botany Bay workboat. So back in the day, she was built at La Perouse for the Australian Oil Company, oil refinery, which is now Caltex, and she was a regular sight on Botany Bay. So although she's used for a general workboat for us now, she was used to transfer men and materials around Sydney Harbour and Botany Bay. Back in the day, built as AOR1, as in the Australian Oil Refinery, people on their way to work they'd catch a tram down Anzac Parade all the way to La Perouse. Then they jump off the trams, they jump on Berrima and go across to work at the oil refinery. So she was kept fairly busy back in those days. Now we go to a 1908 inner harbour motor launch, the Protex. So she was originally named Waikara, as a New Zealand Maori name for smooth water. And I'm not quite sure whether she worked in New Zealand and was transported over here. I haven't been able to locate, I haven't been able to determine that, but she was purchased in 1934 by the Sydney Ferry and Tug Company, Nicholson Brothers. So she worked for Nicholson Brothers for many years. Now, Nicholson Brothers used to name their boats with words beginning with pro. So she was called Protex after a popular brand of soap back in the day. I'm afraid I can't remember Protex soap, but some of you guys might. And so she got the nickname as the soap boat. And it was fitting that her duties included ferrying goods and people from the palm olive factory in Balmain to various city wharves and around places in the harbour. Now, she nearly ended her life in 1952 when she collided with a sister ferry called Provide, and she suffered serious damage and sank, but it was decided to salvage her, and she was eventually returned to service. Moving on to a different sort of life, in 1970, she was used as a ferry, and she operated out of Woy Woy and Toukley, and later between Brooklyn and Dangar Island up on the Hawkesbury River. She joined our fleet in 1981, and she was presented by a Mr. Chris Stannard of Stannard Brothers, and she's been faithfully restored. And again, you'll still see her moving around Sydney Harbour quite frequently. Now we move to the pride of our fleet, I guess. There's a number of boats that are the pride, and and everyone's got their own love. But now we move on and we'll look at the James Craig. Now, James Craig was built in 1874 as the Clan MacLeod. Now, how she came to Sydney Heritage Fleet ultimately is the New South Wales government wanted a tall ship to be the centrepiece of a refurbishment of Circular Quay, Campbell's Cove and the Rocks. So the idea was that she'd sit in Campbell's Cove and look pretty and do all the rest of it. That was not to be, as it turned out. We'll learn a little bit more about that. So she was built in Sunderland in England in 1874, and she sailed the world for over 20 years. So she did over 25 roundings of Cape Horn. So, you know, she was a pretty impressive working ship. And I like to say that if you go back and if you look at old photos of wharves around the world, and certainly in Sydney back in the early 1900s, you'll see lots and lots of ships that looked just like this. So she was basically a hull, big hull in the water just to fill up with about 1,000 tonne of cargo on a good time. And apart from a little bit of structure down aft where the officers lived, most of the crew lived on the upper deck, and the hull would be sealed, and off she'd sail around the world. So, believe it or not, they used to sail this ship with a crew of 17. Now you can understand why a lot of crew jumped ship in these old things, because it would have been hell on earth or hell on the water to be operating her with 17. We sail it now with a crew of over 40. And although a lot of us are old farts, it's still, by the time we just do a day's sail and we come home pretty tired, I can assure you. But she did 26 years on world trade routes. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 started to spell the end of the sailing ships. Steamships coming in, the Industrial Revolution, sailing ships were on their way out. So she was bought by J.J. Craig in 1900, and she sailed the Trans-Tasman route from 1901, and she was renamed James Craig in 1905. So she went back and forth between Australia and New Zealand, usually carrying coal from Australia over to New Zealand, and then timber back from New Zealand to the east coast of Australia. Eventually she was laid up. 1911 she was stripped and she served as a copra hulk in Port Moresby. Amazing the way they used to use these ships and work them as long as they could. But then she was bought by Henry Jones and refurbished for a while, and then in 1925 she ended up as a hulk again, a coal hulk down in Research Bay in southern Tasmania. So she did her job there, holding coal until ships come alongside to take it away. But again, eventually her use became superfluous, and she was beached in 1932. So they were afraid that she was going to become a navigation hazard down in Research Bay, get out into the Don Castro Channel and cause havoc. So a hole was blown in her hull down the stern, and she was beached and she sat there. Now, it turned out that by doing that, that actually prolonged her life, because a lot of, she sunk into the mud and a lot of the hull filled up with mud, and it actually protected it from the ravages of rust and corrosion. And whilst people got on and stripped the hull, you can see the deck is all gone and there's only bits of mast there. She managed to stay there and managed to maintain her shape, and that made her refurbishable. So in 1973, she was towed to Hobart. Oh, this is her departing Hobart, but she was towed up to Hobart and underwent some repairs to hopefully allow her to be towed back to Sydney. So there are over 1,000 hull holes in the hull that they had to temporarily repair, then take it to Hobart and then seal up the hull. They had to put a temporary deck on top to make it watertight, and she was towed up on a wing and a prayer, and eventually got to Sydney and got onto the Sea Heritage dock in 1987. And I'm sure a lot of you will remember her sitting alongside the Piermont Bridge in Darling Harbour for years, and you can see the plates stripped off and the ribs which exposed her. So, but eventually she was wanted to get her going by the bicentennial in 1988, but that didn't come to pass. But eventually she got to sea in the year 2000, and we still regularly sail her now. This picture has her with 21 sails up, and it's a glorious experience to be sailing up and down the coast. I've been on her with the 21 sails up twice now, and we got to about 9 knots going down the coast, down the New South Wales coast. And considering she's got 2 propellers dragging through the water, that's probably not a bad effort. Anyway, back to steamships, we'll look at the John Oxley. So John Oxley was built in 1927 in Scotland. Now, she was purposely built for the Queensland Harbours and Rivers Board as a buoy tender and a lighthouse resupply vessel. Riveted steel hull with teak decks, 2 boilers, because she was originally coal-fired, but converted to oil in 1946. And she's got a triple expansion steam engine, single shaft. And she was handed over to the Sydney Heritage Fleet in 1970, still operational, and that was pretty good. But she was obviously no air conditioning. Old steamship like this would have been very unpleasant sailing up and down the Queensland coast, and she was seen as a bit of a horror ship in her latter years. So she worked for the for the Queensland Harbours and Rivers Board, and pilot vessel in Moreton Bay, and she'd carry pilots up and down the coast. Now, she was pretty typical of a coastal steamship of its time. Many similar ships plied the Australian coast, and you know, with a raised forecastle, a well-decked steam machinery, navigation and midships bridge, wheelhouse. She was again, just typical of a ship of her time. So she continued in service until 1968, and she was when she was donated to the Heritage Fleet in 1970, but eventually taken out of the water to be restored, and we've only just managed to get it back in the water, and we'll see photos of that shortly. But what a lot of people don't realise is that she was taken up by the government in Second World War, and for 3 years, she became HMAS John Oxley. So here she is in a wartime configuration with an extension put on the upper deck, and Erloken gun installed, and temporary accommodation for the RAN guns crew. Relaunched this year, and again, all this plating were originally riveted. We didn't undertake welding, although some of the upper deck work is now being welded. But the deck was totally restored with rivets, and I shudder to think of the number of rivets I've helped put into that ship, and the plates. No wonder I've got a bad back. But here she is as she's being painted and getting ready to go back in the water. And when we did what was called the swap project a few months ago, and it made the news, people in Sydney may have seen it, we put John Oxley back in the water. Here she is alongside around near the Anzac Bridge, and we took Kanangra out and put her around at Rozelle. So now they sit alongside one another as they again gradually get restored. But funding is a never-ending problem, as you can well understand. Back to the Navy side of things, a number of you will remember being pushed or pulled around by Bronzewing and Currawong in Sydney Harbour. They worked out of Garden Island as the standard tugs, small tugs. So they were designed by Navy Office in 1968, and built by Stannard Brothers in Berrima in Brisbane. They only had a bollard pull of 5 tonnes, but that was all that was required at the time. And they were standard workhorses, as I say, and used until 2010. So considering, so what's that, 30, 40, 42 years use, wasn't too bad. And they could move ships of up to 5,000 tonnes and assist with larger vessels. So they sat alongside in the boat pound at Garden Island for a couple of years until we finally talked the government into, or the Navy, more to the point, of donating them to the Heritage Fleet. And in many respects, they really save our bacon. We use one of these to pull James Craig off the wharf when we want to go sailing, and that used to have to be funded commercially. So it was pretty horrendous. So Bronzewing and Currawong have been great. Another boat you remember getting around the harbour, I would imagine, would be the 168. So she was launched in 1937, along with a sister boat, 172. They were built in the boat shed that houses the Naval Historical Society. So she was built at Garden Island, where a lot of you guys spent some time now. And she was built for use as by the district officers in Papua New Guinea. Now, beautiful example of pre-war boat building skills. They had carvel hulls, teak planking. Imagine building a boat out of teak these days, teak planking and upper deck and upper works on Australian spotted gum hardwood frames. So 39 foot, or just over 39 foot, beam of 9'6", and a loaded depth of 4'5". So, and they were originally fitted with chromium plated guardrails. So after the war, the boats returned to naval service when they were redesignated as senior officers' boats, and here their histories diverge. 172 was eventually, she was with the Australian National Maritime Museum for a while, and I think her hull was plated with, was not plated, but it was basically coated with fiberglass. Now, I'm not quite sure where 172 has gone now, but 168 was first used as a tender to HMAS Rushcutter and later allocated to the General Manager of Garden Island Dockyard. And so, and she was then used as a duty boat, transferring stores and personnel between Garden Island and the GID Satellite Boat Building and Repair Facility, the ex-Halverson Yard in Ryde. And here's 172 under repair at the Ryde facility. So used pretty extensively. From there, again, I'm sure most of you, or a good number of you, will be familiar with motorboat 4011, 379, more commonly known these days as 379. Interestingly, from all the old wooden workboats, the 40-foot workboats that you'd all be familiar with, this was an updated design. It was a Navy Office design, 40-foot workboat again, and she was built by Lars Halverson in 1966. And for some reason, I don't know why, she was the only one of her type built. So she was a bit unique, and she was used up until only last year at moving stores and people back and forth to Spectacle Island. So powered by a Cummins diesel, she had a service speed of 11 knots. And I'm sure that a lot of you would have been in this vessel from time to time, or at times. From here, we look at the motor survey boat, Geranium, 1393. Now, again, Geranium was built at Garden Island Dockyard as a full timber teak 34-foot survey motorboat in 1949/50. And she was in service through to 1972. She was also attached to, Her Majesty's Australian ships Barque and Warrego for survey duties at different times during the 1950s through to 1964, and with the naval hydrographer. So shallow draft vessel, only draws just over a metre, Perkins diesel, and with a top speed of about 9.5 knots. So she was disposed of by Navy in 1981, but gifted back to the Commonwealth in 2014, and we put her into our heritage contract under support craft maintenance contract, and Serco actually put a lot of money into Geranium to restore her. So she's actually not a bad boat, but again she was deemed surplus to requirements. Navy doesn't like to spend much money on maintaining its heritage, unfortunately, unlike Army that seems to do it quite well. But Navy doesn't fund it. So again, luckily, we managed to talk the Admirals into donating her to the Sydney Heritage Fleet, where she will be looked after, hopefully, and she'll be around for many, many years to come. Here's a group photo of some of our vessels. The tugs and most of the Navy vessels aren't in this, but this was taken some time ago. But again, you'll see these vessels around Sydney Harbour quite frequently. So who makes it happen? We've got over 1,000 museum members. Not all are active in the museum. Some just help to fund us with their annual dues, which is always very good to get. We do have over 120 active volunteers, and numbers go up and down. And as you can well imagine, COVID has sort of decimated that, and we're trying to build it back up. But with very little money to work with, it's hard to keep volunteers. So it's that, if you don't have the money, the volunteers disappear. When money comes, you gradually get them back. But it's, over 50,000 person hours per annum, which is good. And again, as I mentioned before, we train people in traditional skills, and a lot of multi-skilling. So we have, you might have a doctor who comes into the workshops at Rozelle, and he says, well, I don't want to be a doctor here. I want to learn about electrics. So he works in doing electrical work with the electricians. And other people, I'm a chemist and I don't want to do chemistry or things like that. So I want to plate the hull and I'll learn about hot riveting. So there's a lot of multi-skilling that goes on in our areas. Here's another photograph of Kanangra as she was going down with James Craig beside her, going under the harbour bridge back in April this year. How do we survive? Well, we only just survive. Our funding comes not from the government, although we get the occasional a few dollars from the government, but heritage vessel cruises, charters, and admissions to our vessels around in Darling Harbour. Corporate and private functions aboard our vessels. We use James Craig quite a bit when we can for things like that. We had a few months ago, you can remember how what the rain was like in Sydney, and we had a wedding on board James Craig, and it was one of those days where it was bucketing down, and the bride and groom were determined that they were going to get married on the upper deck, and we took her out into the harbour at the time. We sailed, and I remember as we were going under the harbour bridge, they wanted photos of the opera house in the background, and you could barely see the opera house. That's how heavy the rain was at the time. But all the guests soaked to the skin, they had a ball. We also had a formal dinner on board recently with the pilots come up from HMAS Albatross, actually, and we had a big formal dinner on board the James Craig. So they bring in, those sorts of functions bring in a bit of money. And we also engage in fundraising, gifts in kind. So if any of you guys have got money burning a hole in your pocket, you've got a taxation problem, we're always happy to take some off you because it's all tax deductible. So join the fleet, $66, I think, for elderly member. Every dollar helps us. And if you're really keen to get your hand back into ship restoration or ship operation, you can always come and join us. Charter special vessels. And that's basically the end of the Sydney Heritage Fleet.
Ray, thank you very much. Fascinating, and it's absolutely wonderful fleet of vessels, so many different types. It obviously is a big challenge maintaining them, and I sense there'll be quite a few questions. I won't ask mine first. I'll open the floor if anyone else has got questions for Ray.
Yes, I have a
Please.
question. Just the other day I was in Waverton and I saw the MV Cape Don and looked very sorrowful there alongside. Anything been done with the Cape Don?
Well, Cape Don's not part of our fleet, and we watch it with interest as well, I have to say. And she's looking pretty sad. She's got a beautiful looking funnel, but the hull is looking very sad. And she's struggling like all maritime museum type organisations. She seeks volunteers to try and help, but I don't think she'll ever sail again, and I'll be surprised if she stays afloat. Sadly, so it's difficult. It's a difficult restoration, that one.
Any more questions for Ray? Ray, obviously you made the point about funding, which is obviously essential, plus volunteers. But do you have particular vessels you want to target or obtain in the future? I mean, are you trying to cover a variety of propulsion systems or hull types, or is there an acquisition program that you got?
No, there's not, David. And in fact, it's even taking the old timber workboats from the Navy was a big ask, and we've got to be pretty careful the way we look after them. So I think over the years they look at craft that become available, and if they work out how they can do it, or if somebody's particularly enthusiastic and drives it, then they'll make the efforts. But it's yeah, as I say, things are really, really tight at the moment. So there is no intention, certainly that I'm aware of, and I'm currently on the board of directors at the Heritage Fleet, and certainly there's nothing being spoken about getting new vessels now. And the boomerangs are our biggest problem, and work is it's slowed right down because of lack of funding. So unfortunately, if you don't keep the work up, the vessels deteriorate as you're maintaining them. And Kanangra is a classic example of that, where 30 years ago, she still looked pretty good, and there's been work ongoing, but she's sort of deteriorated over the years. So,
yep.
Ray, yeah, it's Rob Everett here. Look, I'm my great fortune. I'm the executive master of Lady Hopetoun, and if I could start the video, I could show you a terrific picture that might be of interest to all the Navy people listening. In 2013, the Navy chartered Lady Hopetoun when they had a reenactment of the first fleet arrival in 1913. And we had a wonderful day with all the ex-chief of naval staffs on board for the ceremony that went on. And the boat just looked terrific, and they allowed us to fly the white ensign. So we had the white ensign on aft and the Australian national flag up forward, and it was just a wonderful day. And just you said about boilers, we're into our fourth boiler. It's just been connected now, and with a bit of luck, we should be going by about October or November.
excellent.
But I can't start my video. Oh, trap taken from the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I was told to meet the entering destroyers or the entering ships off Bradley's, which I did, and they said just follow them up to Cockatoo. Well, I couldn't keep up with them, so there we are. You know, I just peeled off up near just the other side of the bridge, and followed them back. But all those people on the folks are all, retired chiefs of naval staff. And it was
excellent.
a splendid day. And the boat at the moment is a bit of a mess. We've just put a new deck head on it. That's all. The one you're looking at there is painted green. It's canvas. We've now just yesterday, in fact, completed putting marine ply on, and that'll be fiberglass, and it'll come back looking splendid as it is in that photograph. She's a lovely boat. We're lucky having it.
Look forward to getting her back on the harbour.
Yeah, my word. Very
Rob,
interesting, Ray. Thanks.
Yeah. Rob, is that video on YouTube or available through the web?
No, that's just a still photograph.
Oh,
that
just a
one,
still.
David.
Okay,
Yeah, no, don't have a video. No,
okay.
Sorry.
Otherwise, we can share it with people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lovely shot, though. Yeah, good on you.
Rob, it's David Cunningham here. I noticed you had the white ensign flying on that little bit of video. Well, I hope you had special permission to do that.
Yeah, we did, David. It was it took a little bit of doing, but because we had the admirals on board, they seemed to be fairly happy in the end. In fact, I've still got the flag, as you would imagine. The other thing with the what a lot of people don't see, if I can just put it up again, there it is. Because I'm a retired naval signalman in my earlier naval life, I like flags. So the hoist on the mast of Lady Hopetoun, when we have to dress ship occasionally, says coal fired in the flags. But I think I'm probably the only one that ever realises that. But yeah, Dave, we were legal. Don't worry.
I'm sure you are, or were.
Thanks, mate.
As Ray mentioned, Barque and Warrego, I was on Warrego surveying, and the 34-foot boat there rang a bell, not Geranium. I don't think that was on Warrego. But a question a little bit aside, down in Hobart, I saw a vessel, Lady Nelson, which I believe was a replica of the First Navy Nelson, Lady Nelson. And I guess I'm wondering, does that belong to Hobart? Are you likely to get your hands on it? And also, when I spoke to the people associated with it, nobody knew anything about Lady Nelson or what she'd done or what her history was and where she was going. Anything further on that?
No, I'm aware of her being down there, and we try and get down to the Wooden Boat Festival in Hobart when it's happening. We hope to be down there early next year, and some of our members touch base with these different organisations, but she got no sort of relationship with us, so they've just got a different group down there, and like anywhere, there's different groups all around Australia, all as poor as church mice trying to restore these old boats and keep them operational. But Lady Nelson, from what I understand, is pretty good, and they try and use it for sail training where they can, disadvantaged youth and things like that. So
yeah, she looked pretty good, and I guess what subsequently I approached them about it because, as you'd be aware, the Barque and Warrego with the white funnel, the white ship line, and the buff funnel. Okay, thanks, Ray. Good show.
Pleasure.
Okay. Any more questions? Actually, Ray, I was just interested to know, you obviously sort of benchmark or partner with overseas restoration fleets. Does the Sydney Heritage Fleet sort of, is it a large organisation in comparison with others around the world, or don't you connect with them?
No, well, there's different people that connect with them within our organisation, so we sort of don't do it officially as a board, but a lot of our members do travel to other museums around the world. Yeah, there's bigger ones around, but I think we're quite a we sort of we stand by ourselves, and we're well known. People certainly with old restored sailing ships, we are very well known around the world because we've got one of the best vessels going. But size-wise, membership goes up and down, and everyone struggles with money. So it's a difficult one to answer definitively.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Ray. Last chance, anyone? Well, on behalf of the team, Ray, thank you. And it's most interesting. And I'm really glad that those ex-Navy boats 168 and Geranium have found a good home. Thank you all. And thanks again, Ray. Dave, I guess you'll turn us off. Many thanks.
Yeah, good one, Ray. Well done.
Thank you.